Putin's Russia has always been infatuated with the image of self-sufficiency, a fortress nation, proud, besieged, building its own future with its own hands. That image is a myth. The reality is far more humiliating. Time and again, whenever the Soviet or Russian system slammed into a wall, it did not save itself. It reached outward for Western machinery, Western engineers, Western designs, Western chips, and Western code. This is precisely the part that state propaganda despises. Once you recognize the pattern, much of what passes for Russian strength stops looking original. It starts looking imported, cloned, or reverse-engineered from somewhere else entirely. And that matters, because this same system now wants to do with artificial intelligence exactly what it once did with factories, bombers, and the internet. Take a tool built in freer societies and turn it into an instrument of coercion. So here is the real question. If this empire so persistently boasts of its independence, why does it keep surviving on borrowed power? What follows is an examination of a long, undignified pattern, one in which Western knowledge has repeatedly rescued a repressive Russian state, only to be weaponized against the wider world. Before we get started, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe and hit the like button. Unfortunately, that's just how algorithms works, and I have to ask for this kind of support. It genuinely helps me keep making more content and releasing more videos like this. Thanks a lot for understanding. The weakness at the core. Authoritarian regimes are almost always weaker than they appear. They can police, censor, and imprison. They can stage military parades and publish wildly inflated statistics. But none of that means they know how to generate something genuinely new. Real innovation is a fragile organism. It requires trust, open debate, and the freedom to fail without consequence. It needs property rights that a ruler cannot seize on a whim. It depends on specialists who can tell a superior this won't work without risking their careers or their freedom. And those are precisely the conditions that authoritarian systems find most threatening. A closed empire demands obedience, not argument; loyalty, not independent expertise; predictable reports, not uncomfortable surprises. It can compel people to produce, but it almost never generates the chaotic, unstructured environment in which new ideas grow organically. This is why these regimes so reliably become parasites, highly effective at absorbing technology from the outside, nearly incapable of generating it from within. The Soviet Union is the textbook illustration. In the late 1920s, Stalin was determined to force a colossal industrial leap. He urgently needed tractors, factories, machine tools, and the full apparatus of heavy industry, because the regime understood something elementary. Without industrial power, it might not survive, and without visible industrial triumphs, it could not justify its own rule. But there was a fundamental problem. The Soviet state could order workers around and terrorize peasants. It could confiscate grain, imprison engineers, and issue 5-year plans with absolute confidence. What it could not do was conjure modern industrial know-how from nothing. This is the first lesson worth underlining, because it extends far beyond Soviet history. Whenever a dictatorship boasts of self-sufficiency, the immediate question should be, self-sufficient in precisely what? And this structural weakness in generating innovation does not disappear simply because a regime is large, disciplined, or feared. If anything, scale can deepen the illusion. A massive state can conceal failures for a long time, redistributing resources, cannibalizing one sector to rescue another, and purchasing expertise abroad. But underneath all the noise, the core defect remains. People are rewarded for pleasing the hierarchy, not for telling the truth. Every closed system perpetually faces the same contradiction. It pursues modern outcomes without modern freedoms. Purchased from America, when that approach failed domestically, the Soviet Union looked outward for rescue, and the first great rescue came from Western capitalism itself. Here lies the deep irony of Soviet industrialization. A regime that preached hatred of capitalism turned to capitalist firms the moment it needed machines, blueprints, and manufacturing expertise. And American business was remarkably willing to oblige. Ford Motor Company is among the most striking examples. On May 31, 1929, the Soviet government signed a technical assistance contract with Ford for help constructing an automobile plant and producing vehicles. The future gas factory in Nizhny Novgorod grew directly out of that agreement. Ford was far from alone. Albert Kahn, the great American industrial architect, and his firm were deeply involved in designing Soviet industrial facilities. Between 1929 and 1932, Kahn's company oversaw the design and construction of more than 500 factories across Soviet Russia. Among the most emblematic of these was the Stalingrad tractor plant, conceived with American input, built under American supervision, and equipped by dozens of American engineering firms, whose engineers oversaw installation and early operations. During World War II, that same tractor plant became part of Soviet tank production. Soviet propaganda later framed the entire industrialization drive as a heroic triumph of socialism. That triumph would have been impossible without American and German minds and hands. There is also the question of how a bankrupt Soviet state could afford any of this. The answer lay in brutal domestic extraction. The Gulag system provided unpaid prisoner labor that produced timber sold abroad for hard currency. The collective farm system functioned as a form of modern serfdom. Peasants were stripped of land, tools, and livestock, compelled to work state fields for negligible or zero pay, and the grain they produced was exported below market price, a strategy that undercut Western farmers during the Great Depression while engineering catastrophic man-made famines across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and beyond. The regime also confiscated church valuables as early as 1922. Later, through the Torgson network, ordinary citizens surrendered whatever jewelry or heirlooms remained from better times in exchange for enough money to survive another day. The state sold those possessions abroad, and the proceeds paid for imported equipment, materials, specialists, and technology. Copied to survive. Once the Cold War began, the Soviet Union could no longer simply buy what it needed. The closed empire still depended on external knowledge, designs, formulas, manufacturing shortcuts, but American industry was no longer selling. So the Soviets turned to espionage, seizure, and reverse engineering. This is the chapter that is most frequently misunderstood. The Cold War is often remembered as a clean duel between two self-sufficient superpowers, each generating its own miracles. That is not what happened. The Soviet system continued feeding on knowledge from the outside. It simply did so under cover. The atomic bomb is the most famous case. Soviet science genuinely mattered. There were real physicists, real laboratories, real engineers. But critical American and British secrets were stolen and passed to Moscow through networks that included Klaus Fuchs, Harry Gold, David Greenglass, and the circle surrounding Julius Rosenberg. Once again, the pattern asserts itself. When time was short and survival was at stake, relying purely on domestic development was too great a risk. The state penetrated the enemy's camp and took what it could not produce quickly enough on its own. Sometimes it did not even try to disguise the copying. One of the most almost comically blunt examples involves a handful of American B-29 bombers that made emergency landings on Soviet territory after missions against Japan during World War II. Stalin ordered the Tupolev Design Bureau to replicate the aircraft down to the last detail. The result was the Tupolev T-4, the Soviet Union's first long-range strategic bomber, capable of carrying nuclear weapons, which was, in reality, nothing more than a reverse-engineered B-29. A regime that glorified its own industrial genius had taken a foreign machine, dismantled it, obsessively cloned it, and then presented the result as a symbol of Soviet power. The same logic permeated even the mythology of the space race. People prefer to remember that competition as a clash of American and Soviet genius, but a substantial portion of the early rocket era was built on captured German expertise and imported personnel. The sardonic observation that it was really a race between our Germans and your Germans is crude but touches something real. Both sides had absorbed knowledge and talent from Nazi Germany's wartime program. The difference is that in the Soviet case, this fit into a much broader and more systematic picture. An empire that continuously posed as a civilizational original while borrowing, seizing, or cloning its most essential building blocks from elsewhere. The liberal gift. In the 1990s, the West looked at Russia and saw a broken country on the road to normalization. The governing idea was to connect Russia, modernize Russia, integrate Russia, and the politics would follow. Openness would help. This was the most optimistic phase of the entire story, and optimism, it turns out, can be just as dangerous as greed. In April 1993, at a summit in Vancouver, the United States and Russia agreed to establish a Technology Cooperation Commission on Energy and Space, co-chaired by Vice President Al Gore and Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin. That commission evolved into the Gore-Chernomyrdin Partnership, a broad framework for collaboration spanning energy, space, science, technology, business development, and environmental affairs. In September 1993, Gore stated publicly that his goal was the expansion of American trade and investment with Russia, and the development of cooperation in energy, space, and other advanced technologies. The intention was not cynical. The Cold War had ended without nuclear catastrophe, and there was a genuine desire to prevent chaos, bolster reformers, and draw Russia into a rules-based modern order. Western governments were trying to avert the collapse of a wounded empire that might have given rise to something far worse. But this approach rested on a catastrophically naive assumption that technical modernization and political modernization naturally travel together. That a country which becomes more networked, more computerized, and more exposed to modern systems will also become more pluralistic, more law-abiding, and more accountable. Technology carries no moral passport. It is not inherently liberal or democratic. It is simply a tool, and authoritarian regimes can deploy it for control just as readily as free societies can deploy it for openness. Turned against us. Here lies the tragedy. In helping Russia modernize, the West unknowingly assisted in building the instruments through which the Russian state would go on to surveil and control its own society. Many people still resist this conclusion because they want technology to be neutral and benign. But technology has no loyalty. It goes where power directs it. The Internet is the clearest illustration. In its early years, Russia's Internet genuinely appeared chaotic, open, and ungoverned, a space for journalism, argument, organizing, satire, and improvisation, as unruly as any free society. But the state was studying that chaos with great care. It was learning where the switches were, which companies owned which platforms, who was transmitting what data, who could be pressured, and which systems could be rebuilt domestically. Then, gradually, the open network was converted into a managed one. The logic became increasingly visible. Foreign platforms deemed suspicious, domestic alternatives rebranded as patriotic, personal data treated not as private property but as state territory, and communication fused with identification. Everything people stored in their favorite apps and websites became, eventually, accessible to the state. In 2025, Russia ordered manufacturers to pre-install a state-backed messaging application called Max on all phones and tablets, integrating it with government services as part of a broader campaign to assert domestic control over digital infrastructure. Then, in February 2026, Russia moved to block WhatsApp entirely, openly pushing citizens toward Max. Critics warned of surveillance. The authorities, of course, denied everything. The denial is part of the ritual, the AI trap. And now we arrive at the next phase, the most dangerous one yet. Artificial intelligence is not simply another machine or another network. AI compresses all of the old patterns into a single instrument. It can accelerate research, amplify surveillance, sort populations, automate censorship, improve military targeting, sharpen propaganda, and simultaneously reduce an authoritarian regime's dependence on human judgment. That is why AI matters more than the tractors did, and in some respects, more than the internet does. For an authoritarian ruler, the appeal is obvious. Controlling a bottleneck economy requires controlling access to everything. Traditionally, that required legions of bureaucrats, police officers, informants, and loyal managers. AI does not eliminate that machinery, but it can make it faster, cheaper, and vastly more scalable. In other words, AI can help an authoritarian state govern with even fewer honest feedback mechanisms and even fewer competent people. That is the oldest fantasy of dictatorship. American policymakers understood this, at least partially. In January 2025, the U.S. Department of Commerce announced a framework for the responsible diffusion of advanced AI technology, explicitly stating that advanced AI has significant dual-use applications and that adversaries could deploy American-developed technology in weapons systems and other military programs. Then in May 2025, the department rolled back a specific Biden-era AI diffusion rule, but stated that it was strengthening chip-related export controls through a different mechanism. That tension captures the warning. The old Soviet model of stealing and adapting Western technology was slow. AI compresses that timeline dramatically. If authoritarian systems obtain broad access to the best models, the best chips, the best training environments, and the best data pipelines, they become meaningfully more efficient at suppression. And unlike in the 1990s, no one today has the excuse of innocence. We have already watched what modern authoritarian states do with digital infrastructure, how a connected society can be rolled back into a managed one. The conclusion that follows is uncomfortable but clear. We need to stop confusing modernization with liberation. The West kept assuming that its technologies would carry its values along with them. The Soviet and Russian systems proved the opposite repeatedly. They took the tool, stripped it of its values, and kept the power. If the West makes this same mistake again with AI, it risks handing the Kremlin a cleaner, faster, and colder form of control than anything the Soviet Union ever managed to build.